The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, as found in the 14th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. Jesus is having a rough time in the middle chapters of Matthew, and now he wants to be alone. He needs to be alone. So he gets into a small boat and it withdraws to a deserted place. He needs time to rest and renew his energy. But, as so often happens, the crowds follow him. Hearing that Jesus is on the lake, they follow on foot, bringing with them the sick and injured, hoping that Jesus will offer healing, which of course he does. Jesus comes ashore, sees the crowd, and is moved with compassion, so he goes among them and heals the sick. Think for a moment about what this means. We're told later that the crowd is 5,000 men, not counting women and children, who certainly are present, or why would they be mentioned at all? Some scholars speculate that this means that the crowd might have numbered as many as 15,000. We have no way of knowing how many of those present came specifically for healing, but Jesus certainly must have spent hours moving among the people, speaking words of comfort, laying on hands and healing the sick. His healing interactions were never hurried, never rushed, so it's not surprising that it takes a long time to get through this huge crowd. So, the next thing you know, it's evening, and it's time to eat. It's the disciples who notice the passage of time. They go to Jesus to remind him that this large crowd is going to have to go into the surrounding villages to buy food. Notice that the disciples don't come to Jesus with a concern about the hunger of the crowd and ask for his guidance. They simply present their own solution to the problem. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food. But Jesus has a different idea. You give them something to eat. This clearly is not what the disciples were expecting. "We have only a few loaves and fish," they replied. "There is no way we can feed this crowd." Jesus, again, has a different idea. He tells the crowd to sit down. He blesses the food and gives it to the disciples to distribute to the people. Now imagine for a moment what it would have been like to be in that crowd. What would you have seen that day? How would you have experienced the events that led up to one of the disciples coming to offer you something to eat? A lot would depend on where you were in the crowd. With so many people gathered around, only those who were very close to Jesus would have had any idea what was actually taking place. But what about those who were farther away? What about the people on the fringes of this mass of humanity? I have a pretty good imagination, but I just can't get a handle on the space that would be covered by a gathering of that size. If you were on the outer edge of the crowd, would you even have been able to see Jesus? Your first indication that something was happening would probably have been when you saw that those at the center of the group were all starting to sit down. So you would sit down. The motion would have grown outward, like the rings that form when a rock is dropped in still water. Next, you might have noticed that the disciples were moving among the crowd. As they moved in your direction, you would have seen that they were distributing something. Finally, as they came closer, you would have seen that it was food. They were bringing you something to eat. The disciples were bringing you something to eat. So where was the miracle? You may be familiar with some of the new interpretations of this story. Some say it was a symbolic foreshadowing of the Last Supper, and that each of the 5,000 present, which would mean only the men, received a tiny portion of the bread, similar to what someone might receive at communion. Others say that when the crowd saw that Jesus was going to share food, they were moved by his generosity and pulled out the various provisions that they had brought with them as they journeyed to hear his teachings. The miracle was sharing, not God's divine action in providing food. Personally, I prefer the traditional interpretation. Jesus, through his own power and by some divine means that we cannot hope to understand, took a small meal and used it to provide food for a large crowd, and all ate and were filled. But even this interpretation doesn't give us an answer to that question, where was the miracle? Or perhaps more accurately, who saw the miracle? Remember the old question, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, does it make a sound? Well, if a miracle occurs and nobody sees it, or if only a few of those who are affected see it, was there really a miracle? Jesus fed the crowd, but it seems unlikely that most of the crowd even knew about the miracle that produced the bread. All they knew was that they received a portion from the disciples. Jesus did what was needed without drawing great attention to himself as a miracle worker. What the crowd probably did notice was the hard work of the disciples in their distribution of the bread and their collection of the leftovers after the meal was finished. But just because so few people saw the miracle doesn't change the fact that a miracle occurred. For years, for example, we were told that 40,000 or more children died each day of starvation or malnutrition-related causes. Today, we hear that 20 to 25,000 children die each day of starvation or malnutrition-related causes. That's a significant decrease in numbers. Does the fact that some children still die of hunger negate the miracle that so many more are saved? No. Just as the fact that we don't personally see the children whose lives have been saved makes their lives anything less of a miracle. So, you may be wondering what all of this has to do with Dennis. I mentioned a few weeks ago that Dennis had a passion for feeding the hungry, especially the homeless, which is why I chose this text for today. You see, I believe that every time we fed the homeless at Winter Sanctuary, a miracle occurred. And Dennis was the person who made that miracle happen. Dennis was the one who set up the scheduling of what nights we would go. Dennis was the one who planned the menus. Dennis was the one who made the announcements and exhorted us all to participate in the project. And when St. Paul's was no longer able to provide a location for us, it was Dennis who found us a new location at Church of the Master. The people that we fed never saw the work that went into the meal that was served. I doubt that many of them realized how much effort was involved in feeding and housing them for an evening. What they knew was that they received a hot meal and a warm, dry place to sleep. But the fact that they did not see or recognize the miracle doesn't change the fact that a miracle took place. The miracle that a small congregation like ours could provide a meal for over 100 people, that we could prepare the food, bring it to church, transport it to a different location, and provide the people to do the serving and much of the cleanup. Dennis created this miracle. And there are many miracles here at Atonement. Our commitment to the food basket reflects our continued commitment to feeding the hungry and provides the miracle of meals for many, many families. The knitters do miracles, providing warm handmade sweaters and hats for children who don't get a lot of new clothes. Imagine spending your life living in hand-me-downs and second-hand clothes and being given a new handmade sweater. Our choir does miraculous things, creating a full sound with limited numbers. And the list goes on. But we're in need of a new miracle. We may not be able to participate in Winter Sanctuary this year because Church of the Master will not be available to house our dinners. Dennis was looking for a new site. I don't know what progress he had made. Perhaps one of you feels called to continue his miracle. If not, maybe we should think about what new miracles we can perform with our time and our energy here at Atonement. Amen.